except for temporary purposes to execute the trust. And that was their language. And so, even as late as 1932, after statehood, it was harder to dispose of our lands because they're more arid. They weren't just sold off. And so they said, we're getting to it, it's just going to take more time. We're going to dispose of the lands. The states, in fact, in Utah in 1915, Senate said, hey, you said you were going to dispose of our lands, get on with it. We want to be like all the other states. And they said, okay, it's just your land's more arid, we're getting to it. By 1930, the states were going to President Hoover. He formed a commission, they had congressional hearings. Look at the title of congressional hearings up there. Granting remaining unreserved public lands to the states. Not if. Granting. Now their proposal was, two of the proposals were, we'll give you all the land, we're going to keep all the minerals. Guess what the state said? They probably did some. Yes, sir.
Then in that case, they violated their oath of office, so they're warring with the Constitution.
Well, and there's a remedy for that. That's where this education and this. Now think about what's happening. Education and constitutional principles are now meeting opportunity. We've never been, no nation has ever been this indebted. No nation has ever had deficits like this. No nation has ever faced the things that we're facing right now. And so there's an opportunity that was never present before. I believe this is the right time and the right circumstances with the right situation. So let me just go to this. So now flip me, right? So after nearly 200 years of this trust history, that they're a trustee with a duty to dispose, 1976, Congress just says, it's now our policy to retain these lands in federal ownership. Unilaterally, it's our policy to retain these lands. So you got a constitution over here, sacred trust, solemn agreement. If you look at Article 6 in your Constitution, all agreements entered into before the Constitution will be valid and binding after the Constitution. They were referring to these very trusts in Article 4 that we looked at in the Constitution, where it says Congress has the power to dispose. If you look at the constitutional history, the debate, the notes on the debate, the reason Article 4, Section 3 is in our Constitution, as they were debating it, they said, what are we going to do with these western lands in the Constitution? Oh, we already solved that. We're just going to preserve the status quo. That they hold the lands to create new states, use the proceeds to pay the debt, no other use or purpose whatsoever. We're just going to preserve the status quo. That's what Article 4 says right in the constitutional debate. So then, you get to this. 2009, this is 3-4 years ago. Unanimous Supreme Court decision. Hawaii, their lands had been taken away from the Native Hawaiians in 1893, given to the federal government. Native Hawaiians weren't happy about it, obviously. They have this group that ends up being called the Office of Hawaiian Affairs that's looking out for the interests of the Native Hawaiians. 1959, and they're not silent, right? They're not silent. They refused to be silent. When Hawaii was made a state, federal government says, here's all your land. This isn't a Western thing, guys. You look on that map that you've got, right? Look at Hawaii. It's not red. A little bit. It's not red. It's not a Western thing. So, 1959, they give Hawaii all their land. But they say, okay, we're going to put some trusts on it. You got to use some of this for the benefit of the Native Hawaiians, but you can sell and do what you do. But they give the title of the land to the states. So now 1993, right, 100 years from the time that the land was taken away from the Native Hawaiians, U.S. Senator Daniel Inouye runs an apology resolution. And they pass a bill in Congress that says, we apologize to the Native Hawaiians for what happened in 1893, and nothing in this resolution will impair or change any of the claims the Native Hawaiians have against the federal government. Okay? The state of Hawaii goes to sell some of its lands. Native Hawaiians, Office of Hawaiian Affairs comes in and says, you can't sell any of that land unless you put a lien on it for our benefit because of this act of Congress, 30 years after statehood. Goes to the district court. The district court says that unilateral act of Congress after statehood, that doesn't affect Hawaii's ability to deal with its lands. It goes to the Hawaiian Supreme Court. The Hawaiian Supreme Court says, oh yes, it does. It goes to the United States Supreme Court now on those facts, right? Subsequent act of Congress changing their rights at statehood. On those facts, here's what the United States Supreme Court says. Maybe. Here we go. Here's what the United States Supreme Court says. 4 years ago, United States Supreme Court. consequences of a state's admission are instantaneous. It ignores the uniquely sovereign character of that event to even suggest that somehow subsequent acts of Congress can diminish what was already bestowed. And then look at this. And that proposition applies with even greater force where virtually all of the state's public lands are at stake. Congress does not have the authority to unilaterally change the solemn compact of statehood, the uniquely sovereign character of statehood. And that's all in that law review article. It's on the website. Yes, sir.
So speaking of, some of the biggest federal machinery, so how do you anticipate that machinery working once Utah is able to retain its lands in statehood?
Doesn't apply on state land, does it?
I guess that's the question. How is that going to play out?
NEPA doesn't apply on state lands. It doesn't apply. But we've got our own Department of Environmental Quality. We've got our own departments that, wildlife and natural resources.
Since how we were agreement states with EPA, those were kind of complexities. I was thinking is we still have kind of this federal oversight where they're trying to push from the agreement state standpoint, trying to get these federal regulations to function, if you would, through their same financing mechanisms which we use today. If you spend federal money, then you're obligated to the federal law.
Right. Yeah. Now this doesn't solve all the problems by any means. I mean, I'm not here to tell you it's a panacea to solve all the problems, but it's a big step in the right direction. Because guys, we got unsustainability out there staring us in the face. We've been blessed with the abundance of resource that we can responsibly manage multiple use sustained yield. Show me another solution big enough, because we're in some serious issues. Yes, sir.
The principles that were applied in the Supreme Court case involving Hawaii appear to be analogous to using it against FLIPMA. And if the states, is that on your agenda? Is that in the future, challenging FLIPMA as an unconstitutional act? And wouldn't it be better to go after that and just dispose of that rather than have each state pass a law to try to trump that?
Well, and so that's where you go back to the three-pronged stool, right? I mean, I think the best solution would be let's work out some orderly transfer. But that's going to take education and then negotiation. The more leverage you've got to do that, the better. But you've also got litigation as an option, and our Attorney General's office is already writing the brief. And then, like I said, you can look at the law review article that's up on the website. But then there's also legislation. And so the more Congress begins to realize and run into the fact that remember what she said? We can't afford to pay counties to not utilize their lands and resources.
Has the legislature considered nullification?
Well, let me show you something. Let's see. Here, I'll just tell you. This is, we weren't supposed to see that. Don't just blank that out. I got to set that one up. I don't have an actual photo, but I'm positive this is what my grandmother's chickens look like. When I was about 5 or 6, that's what they looked like to me. And she sent me out to get the eggs, and they would just peck. They were just mean, and they were just, So about 3 or 4 years ago, we got some chickens. And this is what my chickens look like. And when they were ready to start laying, I went out to get the eggs, and I'm strapping on the armor. I'm just going out there as careful as I can, and I go out to get the eggs, and my chickens are going, dude, what? And I actually went back to Cal Ranch. I mean, this is a true story. I went back to Cal Ranch. I said, there's something wrong with my chickens. And they said, what? I said, well, they don't peck. And here's what they said. Oh, yeah, we bred that out of them.
Exactly.
We bred that out of them. Just like Illinois and Missouri, they still pecked. It hadn't been bred out of them. They refused to be silent. And so let me show you what, this is just last year, okay? This is the United States Supreme Court just last year. Federal government's expanded dramatically over the past 2 centuries. It still must show a constitutional grant of power, authorizes each of its actions. Same does not, look at it, the same does not apply to the states, because the Constitution is not the source of their power. Our cases refer to this general power of governing possessed by the states, but not the federal government, as the police power, power over health, safety, welfare, lives, liberty, property. Framers ensured that the powers which in the ordinary course of affairs concern the lives, liberties, and properties of the people were held by governments more local and more accountable than a distant federal bureaucracy. Again, this is the Supreme Court last year. The independent power of the states. Think about it. Just let that one sink in for a second. The independent power of the states serves as a check on the power of the federal government. By denying any one government complete jurisdiction over all the concerns of public life, federalism, you know what that word means, right? Federalism means it's a governing partnership, not a subordinate subdivision top down. Governing partnership, independent power of the state. Supreme Court just last year, guys. Federalism protects the liberty of the individual from arbitrary, they're talking about federal power, right? And then here's the kicker. Again, Supreme Court just last year. In the typical case, we look to the states to defend their prerogatives by adopting the simple expedient of not yielding to federal blandishments when they do not want to embrace federal policies as their own. States are separate and independent sovereigns. Sometimes they have to act like it. Right? Our system was designed with a myriad of checks and balances. And so the latest statement of the Supreme Court is the simple expedient of not yielding. And you're a separate, independent sovereign. Think about what that means. Separate, independent sovereign. That'd be like saying, you know, Moses, I know you did something cool in parting the Red Sea, but to say miracle isn't enough. We're going to call it a miraculously miraculous miracle. Separate, independent sovereign. To say sovereign isn't enough, right? Sovereign means freedom from outside control and autonomy. And then you've got independent and separate. This is the Supreme Court last year. What does that mean? I don't know, but we ought to be figuring it out because 46.1% of our revenues are federally sourced, and they keep telling us they're broke. So here's what I think the Supreme Court just told us. Yes, sir.
Sir, isn't it true that all the power comes from we people in the county?
Well, yes, of course.
Okay.
Yes, of course. And
why
so
are we letting the federal government dictate to us?
it's a good question.
What about the state? Why do we have to call it the state if the county's not independent?
What's that? It's a good question. So we get what we tolerate, and if we don't understand our system, then we get what we tolerate. And the same thing, if you know, the incident of sovereignty, the attribute of sovereignty of being able to tax the land and use the resources to educate kids and provide public safety is taken away, and we're given a promise instead, and that promise is broken and we tolerate it, well, what can you expect tomorrow and next week? And so, yes, sir.
I came in late, so forgive me if I'm behind a little bit here, but I wanted to know, since you passed the legislation in Utah, what's the next step? And I heard a little bit of it, maybe litigation's being prepared, but then also for us locally, Mason County, with the public lands that are being grabbed at the moment by the BLM. What do you recommend for us as a county? And then lastly, how does the Endangered Species Act, Clean Air, Clean Water Act affect all those things above? And if all else fails, what's left?
Just easy questions. I like that. You just throw the easy ones out there. What I recommend is you and your county commissioners that you've elected understand.
There's some here, I think.
Yeah, no,
Yep.
we've got a few of them here.
We introduced them.
But that you understand what jurisdiction is and spend time understanding where the line is. I mean, I wrote this little book over here because when I got elected to the state legislature, I was really perplexed with what's my job? Am I supposed to just...
You have to pay for it, I took one, so.
There you go, good. So we've got to understand that. And I was just in a meeting with some of our commissioners yesterday, and they were talking about the road issues we have in Kane County. They just unfortunately had to go to litigation because they were just closing off roads on them that had been used for hundreds of years, and they went to litigation, had a victory in the litigation here just recently. But one of the commissioners over there said, he says, why do we start out with the assumption that the federal government has jurisdiction, has authority to do whatever it says? Why do we start from that assumption instead of saying, let's understand what jurisdiction is and let's talk about who has authority? Because I got the Supreme Court last year saying lives, liberties, properties, health, safety, welfare, general police power, roads, evacuation, safety, all the rest. Sounds like the Supreme Court's telling me last year that that's an independent power of the states. That's, you know, we put that into 50 jurisdictions and not one. We've got to understand that because it's the nature of government to grow. I mean, it just is. It's the nature of man, which means it's the nature of government to grow power. It's human nature. That's why the founders did what they did and said, we're going to have internal checks and external checks. In fact, you know what Madison said, right? If men were angels, no government was necessary.
Right.
If angels were to govern, we would not need internal and external checks. And so I mean, that really is, I don't mean to be, you know, don't mean to be vague, but it really does come down to those principles of government. There are a lot of examples where counties, particularly counties, because counties are so much more agile. I think counties are in fact, when I was down in Apache County, Arizona, they just did a thing where Apache County, Arizona now, because they stood up and said, hey, you've got to prove to us your jurisdiction. Because we've just had half our forest burned down. We don't want the other half, because if the other half of our forest burns down, we don't have a town left. We don't have a county left. In fact, the commissioners even were at the point of saying, we'll go to jail if we have to. By the way, they were all Democrats, just saying, right? But they said, we'll go to jail before we'll let the rest of our forest burn down. You've got to prove to us jurisdiction to shut this down. Apache County, Arizona's got 4 or 5 sawmills operating right now. They got some doing 2 shifts. They've got revenue coming to town because they said, you've got to show us your jurisdiction because we've got a duty, and the Supreme Court tells us health, safety, welfare is our duty. And so understanding those principles are critical. Now, as far as EPA and some of these other things, like I said, this doesn't solve everything, but it's a step in restoring balance, and it's a big step because accessing the resource, being able to care for the lands, educate our kids, it's a big deal.
Ken, when I read Statehood, the Territorial Imperative by Bill Howell and Bill Redd, it indicated that there's a process that is required whenever and this is for, you know, generally true in any sort of a contractual argument, each injured party must first inform the other party of the injury. Is that what Utah has done through your legislation? And then, secondly, after the other party has been informed of the injury and informed of which portion of the contract has been violated, then that party can begin to take steps towards resolution. And is that, am I off base there, or?
No, I think you stated things pretty well. Yeah, I mean, this is not the pitchfork brigade legislation. This is about putting our governing partner on notice and saying, you know what? We just want you to keep the same promise to Utah that you've already kept with all the states east of Colorado. Because our kids are the lowest per pupil funded in the nation. We've got forests and animals burning up and our watershed being decimated because we can't go in and take care of beetle-killed trees that any one of our foresters on the ground knows you want to get on that as soon as you can.